History Slam podcast from ActiveHistory.ca. Here's your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam, and welcome to the History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham. Coming at you today nearly live. We're in Victoria, British Columbia, part of the CHA 2013 in Congress, which is out here in a beautiful city. And it is a beautiful, bright, sunny spring day with a nice breeze. One of those days that really makes you feel good to be alive. So we're going to talk about death. Because why not? That seems like a natural. Here with Sabine Wieber from the University of Glasgow, art historian studying the history of death mask. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me on.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for doing this. And so it's Tuesday here at Congress. You presented yesterday morning, on Monday morning, a very interesting panel, and your presentation in particular about death masks. And I always sort of judge the quality of presentations a little bit based on the reaction of the crowd during the Q&A. And people seemed very engaged in it and very good questions coming your way. It was really just a terrific presentation. So in terms of these death masks, first of all, what is a death mask?
That's a really good question, because even as someone who is now working on these objects as sort of my research objects, I've had to come to terms with what are these things materially. And I think that's a really good question you're asking to start us off with, because I am very keen to do history through objects, through stuff. So we always have to keep in mind what are these things we're looking at actually. So death masks are basically imprints that have been taken of a person very shortly after their death. So these are ways in which historical actors during the time period that I'm looking at, the fin de siècle, or the turn of the last century, around 1900, were trying to kind of come to terms with or grapple with some big questions about death. So how does a person manifest these last moments of their life, this transitional period between their last breath and then, of course, this idea of their spirit leaving the world. So it's sort of a material trace of that.
So how are they made then? I mean, because I would assume that you don't have a lot of time once the person's dead to be able to make this. So, I mean, what's the process of making the mask?
So the minute it's sort of as a person died, I mean, the death masks that I'm looking at and that survive as historical objects are usually of famous individuals. So I've been looking at death masks of, for example, Gustav Klimt, the famous Austrian painter, portrait painter who painted a lot of society women, and he died in hospital in 1916. So the minute it became known that he had died, a caster, by which I mean not an artist, but someone who is trained as either a model maker for medical models or just like a caster manually, is dispatched to the hospital to then physically take a plaster cast of Gustav Klimt's face. So it is literally pouring onto the face of the deceased individual. You pour on a layer of plaster to capture the physiognomy of the face, including wrinkles, warts, any kind of imperfection. So this is very different from sculpture, which idealizes the human face. This is about the real, the very corporal realities of the face. And you have to be doing this very quickly, because as a person is dead for a longer period of time, the face changes.
Sure.
Right? So the face literally collapses into itself. So it is a process that has to happen, that the taking of a death mask has to happen very quickly.
Yeah.
Now, once that first imprint has been taken, subsequent casts can be made of that master mold. So you can then either pour in a liquid wax, and then you have a wax imprint of that initial cast, and you can then make bronze casts of that, or you can make future generations of plaster casts.
So was it almost this competition then between artists to, like, once someone dies, is like, I'm going to get on this one, or were there agreements maybe with people before they died, or would you need the person's permission? Because I don't know how I would feel as an artist going to a corpse and taking this mold of the person's face if I hadn't had approval from that person. So what was that an issue that you had to talk to the person before? Was there competition between artists, almost like lawyers who were termed like ambulance chasers? Like, is this then an issue in the community, in the artistic community?
I think that's a really interesting set of questions. The competition by the time period that I'm working on was definitely there because it was big money. If you were the one who took the cast of a famous composer or a famous artist or a famous poet, you could really catapult that into a good income. So the geographical locale that I'm focusing my research on is Vienna. I'll give you the example. In Vienna, there were probably about 5 to 10 casters, model makers, who would regularly compete for getting access to the corpses of famous individuals. So yes, it was a competition. In terms of consent, it was really down to the family in many ways to allow to have a death mask taken or not. I should add to that, though, that by the sort of turn of the last century, this whole genre of death masks was very popular. It was almost a convention. So it was almost assumed that if you were somebody in Vienna, that your death mask would be taken for sort of a record for eternity.
Okay. So someone like me wouldn't have to worry.
You would probably not have someone take a death mask because, you know, the
interest... to be important to have that happen.
You're not important enough.
Exactly.
But that raises an interesting issue because death masks are coming back a little bit now in the present moment as a way of, the German term is Trauerarbeit, a way of doing the work of mourning, of grieving someone. So in certain religious circles, but also not necessarily religious, it is a way of trying to come to terms with your loved one's death. So if you today, you could have your death mask, or your loved ones who you left behind. You could probably say that you wanted one taken, but so yes, it's a very different socioeconomic situation today than around 1900.
And so you sort of alluded to it a little bit, but what was the purpose of them? I mean, you talk about that they were big business for these artists, and especially in Vienna. And we'll talk about Vienna because the sociology of this I find really fascinating too. But if I have one of these things in my house, I mean, what is that? Why do I want it? What does it say about me? Am I trying to reconcile my own connection, whether it be personal or because this is a notable person, and how I feel about this person's death? Or is it a social marker as a way to say this is what I'm interested in? Or even if it was a political figure, maybe a way to signify your political affiliations. So really just why would I want this in my house?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I think you covered some of the reasons why people would collect death masks and display them in their houses. Now, the first reason is, so they're private and public, the reasons that death masks start appearing in upper middle class homes. And let's just say it's a very sort of socioeconomic privileged collecting practice.
Yes.
So you would find these objects either in music rooms or in salons. So for private contemplation, it was really a meditation on death, on dying, on sort of having a physical, embodied kind of relationship, you as the beholder of the death mask to the person that has passed away. So, for example, in Vienna 1900, if you had the privilege of owning a death mask of, for example, the famous composer and conductor Gustav Mahler, then you would, and if you'd known Gustav Mahler or you admired his music, then you could retreat retreat into your own music room, maybe play some music yourself on the piano, and really kind of think about this relationship between yourself personally and this artist figure, right? Sort of this very deeply emotional and contemplative, philosophical engagement with death. But I think they weren't just private objects, they were also very public objects, public in quotation marks, because they would still be in domestic settings. So if you had death mass in your salon, for example, and, you know, in Vienna 1900, it was very important to host weekly salons, so to invite all of your friends and all of your political allies and everybody to your house to converse, to listen to music, to drink. So if in that sort of setting you had a death mass, it became almost like a conversation piece. You could showcase that you were culturally that you were educated, that you were accultured, and that you also had particular, not maybe big P political affiliation, but little p political affiliation. So again, if you had Gustav Mahler's death mask in your salon, he was Jewish, he was quite controversial because he performed and conducted very modern music. So it was a declaration in many ways of who you wanted to be, who you were. So it fulfilled this dual function of private emotional meditation, but then also staking a claim socially. And sort of almost putting yourself into this, what I call the pantheon of great artistic genius, right? You're creating, rather than creating a political genealogy of great rulers that, you know, make history, you're creating a cultural genealogy that you're sort of the offspring of this kind of a genealogy.
Now, you sort of alluded to it a little bit, this dealing with death, and because the concept of death, I think, is really fascinating because, well, we don't know really what happens. Like, you know, but we know that everyone's going to die, but we don't really know sort of the overall purpose of like what's going to happen once that actually happens. So is part of this mask collecting, mask making, a way to address the fear of death? Because one of the things that you mentioned yesterday is in a lot of these masks, even though it's a dead person who's being cast, a lot of them, the person looks very strong, and they look very alive,
at peace. So
is this a way to confront death and make it less intimidating in a way?
I think that's maybe a little bit of a modern way of thinking about it, thinking or phrasing it in the terminology of confronting death. So death is always a second-hand kind of experience, right? You are observing death, but you don't know how you will die, right?
Yeah, nobody can tell you the experience of dying.
Exactly. But you can observe other people dying, or you can, in the case of death mask, you can look at, as an observer, what death looks like in its physiognomic manifestation, in its facial manifestation. So I always think about death mask as making present an absence, right? Because a death mask is very material, it's an object, it's a very physical thing, but it is really trying to trace something that is no longer there. By the time you have a death mask hanging in your music room or in your salon, the body, the dead person, is long buried and, you know, is starting to disintegrate. So it's this idea of, yes, it is an engagement with death, but it's not sort of to make yourself feel good about it or confronting it. It is more about really sort of asking the big existential questions. And I think in that sense, death masks become an aid, a means through which you can be catapulted into a philosophical engagement with what it means to die and to encounter death.
So that's part of this whole thing, too, this idea of a funeral is not really for the dead person. It's for the people who are still alive who need to confront the loss, because the dead person doesn't care. They're dead.
Yes.
So they're not at the funeral
Yes.
in a metaphysical sort of sense. So it's part of that same mentality then of for as much as it's about the dead person, it's really more about the people who are still alive and need to deal with this in some way.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And in the Viennese context, which some historians have, Vienna has always, and to this very day, that's a Freudian slip if there ever was one, Vienna to this very day is thought about as the city that embraces and celebrates death. I mean, in a morbid kind of way, right? So this idea of if you go to a funeral in Vienna and then you have the wake afterwards, that's the term, isn't it? Wake, where you go to drink and eat.
Yeah.
And,
the party.
the party,
the death
exactly.
Party.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about the living people.
Yeah.
And it's this idea of really celebrating what they call a beautiful corpse, a schöne Leich, a really, that was, and by that they don't just mean that the body of the deceased was a beautiful person, they mean the whole pomp and circumstance around it was just, it was pompous and it was elaborate. So I think in that sense, death must fall into this, what I call material culture of death, but very much designed for the living.
I guess one of the other questions then too is, in confronting this by the living, is it part of this ever or never-ending quest for immortality that humanity has been on forever? Is that we just don't want to die. And, one of the things that I've sort of come to realize in the past few years is one of the reasons I think I like studying history so much is that I'm actively engaging with dead people on a daily basis. I'm reading their letters and trying to interpret what they say. So in a way, I'm almost having a conversation. And in that way, even though they're dead, their voice still exists. And perhaps one day when I'm dead, I'm hoping that someone will do that for me. And that way that even though I'm gone, that my voice still has some sort of agency to it. And so I'm wondering if the masks may be part of that as well. And giving agency back to the dead people, and even unconsciously as the living, saying that yes, you die, but you don't necessarily go away. It's not a situation where death is the end, and we can prolong your voice, your impact, your influence long after you're gone.
Yeah, and I think the powerful thing about death mass is that, because, what you talk about is through text, right? For example, or as a historian, you usually the first thing you look at is have these individuals written something or has something been written about them. So I think what's particularly powerful about the death mass is that although we have Gustav Klimt's paintings, or we have Franz Liszt's compositions, or we have Rainer Maria Rilke's poems, whatever it is, we also have the author's physical imprint.
Yeah.
So it is one step it's almost like a bodily engagement with the not ephemeral, but with text, with music. Yeah, in a way ephemeral, right? I mean, you have the notations for the music, but they have to be performed.
Sure.
So the person the hand of the painter, the ear of the composer, all of that is gone, but we still can, through these death masks, in some very interesting and obviously psychologically quite loaded way, we can still almost see the physical, the specter, the physical body of the genius artist in it.
So you're studying Vienna, and these masks, at least I'd never heard of them before. So in the North American context, it's either just a gap in my knowledge, or they weren't as widespread as they were in Vienna. So what is it particularly about Vienna that makes these masks so popular? I mean, you mentioned the celebration of death that exists in the city, but why does the city react that way to death? I mean, what is it about the people there that leads to this growth of death masks?
I mean, I sort of harp on about Vienna because that's my area of research. I mean, death masks between the 1870s and really up to the First World War were very popular across Europe. So the case I'm making for Vienna is I'm tying it into this very specifically Viennese fascination and celebration of death. But they were produced all across Europe. And indeed, they were avidly collected by North American collectors. There's a really big collection in New York of something like 400 death masks.
Oh, wow.
Don't quote me on that. I need to look it up again. But yeah, so they were actively collected in the U.S. As well. So why at this particular moment? What is it about Vienna that we have this popularity of death masks and then all of a sudden they drop off of the surface, right? Yeah. And I would argue that Vienna is a place that the Viennese medical school, so the way in which they trained physicians in the late 19th century, was about the body. And it was all about pathology. It was about trying to find out the physiological causes of illness. It was trying to find out, I mean, although we always associate Vienna with Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis, which is all about the archaeology of the mind, actually in the in the 1890s and the sort of turn of the century, what one calls somatic psychiatry, that is a psychiatry that was looking for physical traces of mental illness, for lesions in the brain, was the dominant discourse, was the dominant practice. So historians have slightly skewed the picture here. So I think death masks function within this more, the popularity of death masks is linked into this more general and very pervasive interest in the body, in the diseased body, in the root causes of disease, because in many ways death masks are part of that, right? It is looking at the physiology of dying, looking at the way in which, what does death look like physically? Right. And so I think that is why in Vienna in particular, these death masks were so sought after, because Viennese collectors were just so entrenched in these bodily discourses of the healthy and the diseased human body. And that's why I'm really interested in thinking about them less as fine art objects, although they were expensive and they were traded through antiquarians and, you know, through the kind of places you would purchase art in. They weren't mass consumption kind of products that we think of today, but I think they function within the more and very typically Viennese medical discourses of the body and physiology.
Then that leads me to a question of, then let's say I get shot in the heart, all right? There's no disease, so a mask of my face doesn't really do anything. I mean, it looks the same. I didn't die of anything other than this gunshot that's in my chest. So because of that, because there are certain diseases then that the face wouldn't really capture that notion of death and this connection to the body, was there any discussion or did anyone maybe pursue death masks beyond the first however many hours you have and in which they were done? So let's say maybe this would require written consent of the person, but you do an ongoing mask and you do it maybe monthly for a year after the person dies or something like, but you know what I mean, like sort of to show the progression of the body. Of death in a different light.
Well, see, that is sort of, I see the logic in that, but we must remember that Vienna was deeply Catholic.
Right, yes. So
that kind of an investigation would be deeply problematic. So what I'm trying to say with this argument around the fascination with the workings of the body and the bodiliness of death, I think for me, death masks are an extension of that way of thinking. So just as much as you wanted to find out what are the physiological causes of mental illness, you wanted to see the material traces of the moment of death. You wanted to capture that in a bodily sense. So I'm not trying to suggest that the death masks were an extension of autopsy. You know, when you said if someone died of a gunshot wound, there wouldn't be any traces of that in the face. I'm not making that direct a link between death masks and physiology and pathology, but I'm saying that if we think about the kinds of visual literacies, the kinds of things people would look at and engage with, are very much focused around the body and around trying to understand the body, then I say that death masks are part of that larger, very Viennese project or endeavor. Okay. It's sort of an and it's very different from the spiritual understanding of death and dying. Right? It's a trying to, I mean, literally, it's trying to capture the last moment of a person on Earth. Right.
So you mentioned that the sort of turn of the 20th century?
Turn of the last century is usually how I get around that one. It's fin de siècle.
Okay, yeah, and you talked a little bit in the presentation yesterday about the war on the start of the First World War in 1914, and you showed some. I think there were photos or really masks of people who had been wounded in the face in the war and had serious wounds. Like one guy had his nose,
lower face, basically blown off.
Pretty much gone.
Yeah.
Now, were those masks or those photos part of the downfall of these masks, that people didn't want that violence and the fact that the mask went from really these strong figures in death to damaged, disfigured figures? Is there a connection then between the slow evolution of masks or the decreasing interest,
the waning popularity, really, right?
Of masks associated with the Second World or the First World War, and people having to confront violence and death in a new way?
Yeah. I mean, the argument that I would like to make around this issue is that around 1900, when death masks were so popular, it was really trying to capture the sort of the peacefulness of dying, the sort of physical traces of this, and as we talked about this earlier, a sort of philosophical engagement with, this is what it's like to die, and doesn't Gustav Klimt look so at peace, and he's finally no longer battling with all of the illnesses he had. So that's the 1900 moment. Now, with the onset of the First World War and the really all-pervasive physical realities of warfare being shared through newspapers, through veterans returning home completely disfigured, I think this idea of a peaceful death no longer is sustainable.
Right.
And the realities, so those photographs that I showed of these incredibly disfigured soldiers, once you've seen that, you can no longer, I would argue, engage in a philosophical contemplation around death, because there is nothing redeemable about death once you've seen those images.
Right.
So as a visual and as a material object, they no longer work. That's the argument that I'm trying to make.
So does that too then sort of address maybe a criticism of the mask, of that they're very morbid? Because if people aren't interested or they don't want to see it in this violent form, then maybe that would say, well, no, it's not a morbid thing that we're doing, because, maybe there's an argument that more violent form of death is more morbid, or there'd be more morbidity in wanting to view that as opposed to simply the more peaceful death. So does that address concerns over morbidity?
I mean, the kind of images I showed yesterday, these were still living veterans, right? So they weren't death masks. I think what I would say to that question is, and the reason I was thinking about those photographs of these very disfigured war veterans was I was trying to figure out why after the First World War we only have books that show black and white photographs of death masks rather than death masks in and of themselves. So again, this idea of morbidity, this idea of the difficult death, I think if you look at this physiological trace of someone's face, it makes it too real in relation to the war, the aftermath of the war. So my argument is that it can no longer be a material object, a death mask. It can't circulate as that. It has to be one step removed. It has to be a photograph, a dramatically lit, beautiful object that no longer recalls so much the actual individual, the human body. It becomes it becomes disembodied, right? Because when you physically look at a death mask or you actually handle it, you hold it, although they're very fragile objects, but if you actually handle them, it is body to body. But that relationship is completely shut down, disrupted by the war. So you can no longer, it doesn't work anymore. People aren't able to engage in that kind of an exchange. And that's why now we have photographs of death masks during the 1920s that come up, because you still have a need to create this pantheon of great cultural achievement. So you still want to kind of create this genealogy, and even more so after the war. I mean, the Germans started the war, the Treaty of Versailles, we have the war guilt clause. So we have to prove as Germans even more that we are actually cultured. We are not just soldiers and generals who bring destruction about. So we still have the need to show our cultural heritage. And so rather than using the concrete objects as they did around 1900, we're now using photographs of them to do this.
And then you also showed photos of dead children who were staged almost like you would go take your kids to a photo place now, and if they were alive. But they're staged, and the one that I remember specifically was a little girl who was sitting up who almost looked alive. And I sort of looked at it, and then you said, well, here's a picture of a dead girl. I thought, oh, and then I looked at it again. I was like, oh, yeah, her eyes aren't open, and I guess she's dead. And so is that, again, part of this process of then removing that connection to death? And even getting back to this issue of being morbid, I mean, taking photographs of dead children, there's a certain... Just saying that sounds morbid, but is that part of this larger process that's going on?
Okay, so those photographs of the dead children, so there's a couple things. I think what we now often see as morbid with our modern sensibilities was not seen as morbid in Vienna around 1900. I think individuals so the photographs I showed were actually from the pre-war period, and I was trying to make the argument that there was just a different engagement with death at that particular historical moment around 1900. And I think that's the key. I mean, when you think about a big metropolis like Vienna in the 1890s, you as an individual would be much more often confronted with death than you would be in a modern city today, right? There was disease, there was malnourishment. I mean, you would be coming across death on a more regular basis.
Especially children too, right?
Exactly. Huge mortality rates amongst children. So what we now look at as morbid was not seen as morbid at the time. Now, the really fascinating thing about this photograph you mentioned about the little girl who's kind of propped up in front of a white curtain with some sort of angel figures displayed on either side. When you look at it very carefully, there is actually the mother of the child sitting behind the curtain holding her up. So again, it's a very sort of technical and practical thing, right? Because otherwise it's a dead body, so the child would fall over. But I also, in my interest in the sort of bodily engagement with death. It's that physical contact with the dead child. The mother is physically holding the dead child as the photographer takes the photo. I think is yet another sort of piece of evidence that strengthened my argument about the different kind of relationship to and with death that existed in Vienna 1900 than our own relationship today. And I think that's what's so interesting to us as art historians, where we take dying or death and we sort of look at it at different historical moments, and all of these new ways of thinking about it open up for us.
Yeah, because in everything I've read, and it's been associated with the war, or both wars actually, both world wars, the way we confront death today is very different in a lot of ways, but also in that it's a much shorter relationship with death. That someone dies, you have the visitation, and then you have a funeral and a wake, and then it's almost as if that's it.
Yeah.
And I know when my grandmother died in 2000, one of the things that someone said to me at the funeral was that the toughest day is going to be tomorrow. Because for the first 4 days, everyone's around, and there's a lot going on, you don't really have a chance to think about it. But then the next day, everyone's gone, and you're just sort of left. And that relationship with death, or the communal relationship with death, only lasts for a couple days, and then everyone's sort of expected to pick up the pieces and move on.
Yeah.
Like you say, when we're talking about, is this morbid? Maybe it seems morbid, but again, that relationship and how we deal with death and how we process death has changed so dramatically over the past 100 years.
Absolutely. And I think, I can't really add anything to that, because I think you hit the nail on the head there. It is.
I don't do that often. So.
And I think, again, that's how we can think about death mass. It gives us a continued physical presence, although in a sort of weird kind of simulacra, kind of Jean Baudrillard kind of way of the person that is no longer there. Right? So we can continue. It is communal in many ways too, because when you have the salon and you converse with your friends about this person and the music that the person composed and all of that, it continues that, right? That sort of physical presence almost.
Yeah, and like you say, the power of it, the materiality of having that is there's more power to that than a picture.
Absolutely,
say.
Absolutely.
You sort of mentioned this as an art historian, and so you would be looking at this in a very different way than I would be in just a pure history point of view, and I'd be sort of like, why did these people do this and this? But you are also looking at the artistic side of things, so you have this different perspective. So you mentioned yesterday that mass would be a good avenue to engage in this interdisciplinary approach. So I'm just wondering if you wanted to expand on that a little bit and sort of explain what you mean and how exactly those mass would help accomplish that interdisciplinarity.
Yeah, I think interdisciplinarity is an important buzzword at the moment, or because I hesitate to call it a methodology, right? Yeah. Because I think interdisciplinarity is not something you simply apply to a subject and then you've studied it. Mieke Baal has this wonderful way of thinking about interdisciplinarity, where she says you don't study an object through interdisciplinarity, you bring the object to life you create the object through interdisciplinarity, and that's very much how I would like to think of it. So in this instance, with the death masks, yes, I am an art historian, and I am very vested in the kind of historiographies and methodologies of my discipline. So in the first instance, I would look at death masks for their materiality, who were the people who created them, how were they made, really how we started this conversation when you asked me what is a death mask. And I came across them because they're now housed in museum collections. So they have an art historical importance. So that's my first sort of point of entry, is from within my own discipline. But then I also think I'm very much interested in them as material objects. And the minute you talk about death masks as material objects, you have to sort of think about the kind of social relationships into which they were tied or which they activated at the time. And that's where the interdisciplinarity comes in. That's when I started to sort of think about, okay, so we've got these really interesting plaster casts of faces of dead people. What other kinds of material objects objects were around at the same time that might function in similar ways. And I mean, of course, the first place you would then look would be medical history or sort of objects from medical discourse. And before I worked on death masks, I was involved in a project looking at history of psychiatry. So I knew already that there were wax models made of faces of mental patients in asylums. So I immediately kind of thought, wow, there's a real similarity visually and materially, if nothing else, between these medical models and the death masks. Then you start thinking beyond art history. Well, you start still staying within art history, kind of thinking, okay, how do they relate to sculpture, right? Because in a certain way, they are 3D objects. And what other 3D objects are there in history of art? They are sculpture, right? Carved out of marble or carved out of wood. So that's, again, within the discipline, but it's a different medium. And a lot of art historians just work on painting or just work on sculpture or just work on architecture, whatever it is that they work on. So it's really, the interdisciplinarity comes in for me because I'm really trying to understand, as a historian, how did these things function at the time? And I think and I don't think we are so different as historians or art historians in that context. We try to, I think that historians are moving way beyond just looking at texts, right? Way beyond the archive. I studied with Lea Rauslander at University of Chicago, who used to be a furniture maker and now works on material culture. She looks at stuff, although she still says that sometimes it's a little bit difficult for some of her fellow historians to understand what she's trying to do with stuff. So I really don't think that there are so many differences, because what really unites us is this desire to understand and reconceptualize to a certain degree how historical actors engaged with the kind of, in my case, objects I'm interested in. And so if I wouldn't be working in an interdisciplinary manner, I would be missing out a great part of the story that is to be told.
And then just on a practical, everyday perspective, how do you deal with this? Just on a very personal level, you're dealing with death every day, a very upfront form of death. Does that ever get to be a little much? Did you ever just have to go and watch a puppy on YouTube or something to feel that? Like seriously, like it seems to me that this could be a subject that could be somewhat depressing, for lack of a better term. And it's something that I don't know if I could do. Which is why I asked the question.
I don't want to make light of this, but my colleagues think of me as the one who's interested in the morbid themes and the weirder the better. So I've moved from working on mental institutions to looking at death, and my next project is on slaughterhouses. But coming back to the death masks, those photographs of the young children around 1900 who had died and whose families have then brought them to a photographer's studio to have photographed in the fold of a family portrait, or those kinds of objects I showed made out of hair of a dead one turned into a bracelet. All of those really bodily connections to death. As much as I want to stand back as a historian, as a detached observer, there are moments where it gets very difficult and where you sort of draw on your own personal experiences with death. And when you talked about the funeral of your grandmother, those things go to my mind a lot of the times. But I think that is exactly the reason why I'm the right person to look at that, because that's what I say to my colleagues who say, oh my God, how can you work on slaughterhouses? This is horrendous. But then I say, yeah, that's exactly why I work on them, because I have empathy and emotional investment in this.
Right.
It's this rather than just,
complete detachment.
Exactly. Right. Because, the writing of history is a deeply personal practice as much as it is a fact-finding mission. And that's what attracts me to history and to art history.
Well, it really is fascinating. So if people want to get more information, on what you do, what's the best way for people to do that?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is if you are in Europe at all from October to January, come to the National Gallery in London and check out the Facing the Modern Viennese Portraiture 1867 to 1918 exhibition, which will feature death masks and the exhibition catalog will feature my essay on death masks, where I talk about all of the things that I mentioned today. And other than that, I mean, just sort of keep looking out for my next project on slaughterhouses. And if they want to get in touch, look at the University of Glasgow website under my name, and they can email me or
terrific.
Get in touch that way.
Sounds great. Well, thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me on. It was a real privilege to speak about my own work in such detail. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's Sabine Wieber from the University of Glasgow, and our thanks to her. Anyway, if you have questions, comments for the podcast, historyslam@gmail.com. You can find me on Twitter at Dr. Shawnee Fever. And if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for me.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Be sure to check out Active History for more features, articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.